So, Joe, would you like to introduce our next speaker?
Absolutely. Daniel Dombrowski is professor of philosophy at Seattle University. Among his 22 books are Rethinking the Ontological Argument, a Neoclassical Theistic Perspective, Contemporary Athletics and Ancient Greek Ideals, and Process and Political Liberalism, Rawls, Whitehead, Hartshorne. He is the editor of the journal Process Studies and is a past president of the Metaphysical Society of America. His paper today is The Dipolar Character of Being in Plato and Whitehead.
Thanks so much, Joe. And thanks to you and Brian for all the work you have done to put this together. It's a lot of work, I know. My paper is on the dipolar character of being in Plato and Whitehead. It'll touch on some of the themes talked about in Sylvia's paper yesterday. She mentions dipolarity at several points. And Joe is going to be scrolling down my paper, taking care of the technology stuff for me here as I read the paper. So on the information highway, I have a flat tire. So I'm really happy to have Joe help out here. So the four sections to the paper, the first is an introduction. At several points in his writings, including in the 2 volumes of his Harvard lectures published thus far, HL1 and HL2, especially the latter, Alfred North Whitehead defends a metaphysical view of being as dipolar. It has often been noticed by process thinkers like Leonard Eslick and Charles Hartshorne that Plato's view is also dipolar. The purpose of the present paper is to detail what it means to say that being is dipolar in Plato. Further, I will explore the extent to which dipolarity in Whitehead is indebted to Plato and the extent to which Whitehead's dipolarity is different from Plato's. The importance of the topic at hand is highlighted in Eslick's claim that the doctrine of the dyadic character of being is one of the most extraordinarily subtle and powerful positions in the history of thought and one of the least well understood. The only scholarly treatment thus far of the relationship between Plato's and Whitehead's between Plato and Whitehead's Harvard lectures is Alyosha Bervet's footnotes to Plato. Bervet rightly emphasizes 4 points of contact. I have no disagreements with Bervet, but I would like to add a 5th major point of contact between Plato and Whitehead, the dipolar or dyadic character of being in these 2 thinkers. This dipolarity reinforces and illuminates the 4 major points emphasized by Bervet. So the second section of the paper deals with dipolar being in Plato. The best study of the dipolar character of being in Plato is a magisterial 1953 article by Eslick, who was both a Platonist and a Whiteheadian. The key idea is that if being is conceived in a strictly univocal way, such that it cannot admit of differences, then all being is one. The most prominent defender of this view was Parmenides, who correctly realized that if being were univocal, then any differences had to be extrinsic to being rather than intrinsic to it, and hence such differences could only come via non-being. But absolute non-being, he rightly noted, is unthinkable and cannot exist. To say that absolute non-being is to contradict oneself. The conclusion Parmenides drew was that multiplicity, diversity, and change are ultimately unreal. However, despite the possible validity of Parmenides' argument, it is unsound due to the obvious facts of multiplicity, diversity, and change. Plato's advance over Parmenides requires the admission of some sort of existence for non-being, but for relative non-being or otherness, rather than for the absolute non-being that Parmenides legitimately criticized. To cite a simple example, a carrot is nothing like a corkscrew, not in the sense that either is utterly non-existent, but rather in the sense that the two are other, they are different. For Plato, to be is to be one, but this does not mean that the 2 terms being and unity are convertible, and that to be is also to be other than the one. An existing unit, in effect, is a composite of 2 different elements, unity and something other than unity. Unity strictly in itself is absolutely simple, and hence it cannot be the subject of predication, as in the first hypothesis of Plato's Parmenides. Even if we say unity is, we would be putting unity in relation with others that are, thus destroying its strict simplicity and undivided nature. Every existing unit is therefore something other than simple indivisible unity. If being were only simple indivisible unity, it could not enter into relations that are presupposed in any intelligible discourse. At the other extreme, if beings are constituted to be what they are entirely by the relations into which they enter, a hypothesis explored in Plato's description of perception in the Theaetetus, the whole of reality becomes a flux without any stable or enduring objects. But there are stable or enduring objects. If reality were pure becoming, knowledge and discourse would become impossible, in that every unit and every term would dissolve into its relations. But knowledge and discourse are possible, hence the equally severe problems with runaway Heracliteanism, as were found in an overly aggressive Parmenideanism. There are thus two demands that give rise to the dipolar or dyadic character of being in Plato. Being must be both unity and a dynamic whole of parts. It must be both in itself and in relation. In addition to the aforementioned discovery of relative non-being in the sophist, another Platonic discovery that is crucial in the articulation of the dipolar or dyadic character of being in Plato is the claim that being is power or dynamis, specifically the power to affect others in however slight a way, and the power to be affected by others, however minimally. Unfortunately, instead of and, kai, Plato says or, ite. The import of this definition of being as dynamic power, which is cited many, many times by Whitehead and Hartshorne, the import of this definition of being as dynamic power is that no being could be wholly self-enclosed and separate in complete isolation from others. Nothing can exist unless it is in relation to others. But in order for it to be in relation to others, it has to exhibit some unity or self-sameness, however transitorily. Plato's new position, which is neither exclusively Parmenidean nor exclusively Heraclitean, is one that not only commits parricide on Father Parmenides by positing the existence of relative non-being or otherness, in addition to follow Plato's own familial metaphor, being is like a child crying for both unity or self-sameness and relations. Plato, like Kant and Whitehead, wants to save knowledge and intelligible discourse, and it wants to save knowledge and intelligible discourse, and the only way to do this metaphysically is through the view of being as dipolar or dyadic. The theory of being as dipolar or dyadic in Plato involves 5 major forms: being, obviously, but also sameness, otherness or relative non-being, rest, and motion. To cite just one easy example, the form of motion is the same as itself, but other than the rest. Intelligible discourse requires that we keep in mind the distinction between what each being is in itself and what it is in relation to others. The other exists for Plato precisely as relative non-being, so as to dynamically advance beyond the frozen absolute monism or black universe of Parmenides. Although each existent has a certain degree of unity, it is not the one, but is rather a reflection of unity in others, to use the language of the sophist, or in the unlimited, to use the language of the Philebus, or in the receptacle, to use the language of the Timaeus. The modern concept of substance as that which requires nothing else in order to exist is as foreign to Plato as it is to Whitehead. So that's what I want to say by way of summarizing the dyadic character of being in Plato. Now, I'd like to talk about dipolarity in the Harvard lectures. The relationship between Plato and Whitehead on dipolarity is itself an example of sameness in difference, thus illustrating the overall contention that being is dipolar. It is well known that there's a pervasive view of Plato wherein the forms are seen as completely separated from the world of flux and are in effect seen as Parmenidean ones. Plato himself may have held this view at certain points in his career, but what I have said above indicates that in Plato's later dialogues, including the Parmenides and Sophist, this view is criticized. A more defensible view is that abstract objects cannot be completely ripped away from the particular events in flux. They can be separated only in idea. Each one is influenced by the rest of the real, including by the past, such that 2 fatal moves would be to either altogether neglect the past or be enslaved by it. There's always the creative synthesis of causal influence from the past and decisions regarding abstract possibilities. Each unit occasion in Whitehead is, as in Plato, a union of being and non-being, although Whitehead attributes this view to Aristotle. In any event, Whitehead seems to have thought that the virtues of Plato and Aristotle together are needed. Like Plato, Whitehead sees as integral to any defensible metaphysics a prominent place for sameness and otherness. Or to put the point diachronically, there needs to be a prominent place for partial confirmation to the past as well as passage into otherness. The misleading Platonic view that formal beauty involves an escape from this world into a separate world of forms is best replaced with a more authentic Platonic and Whiteheadian view that formal reality and beauty are embedded in the harmonies and flux. Plato did, in fact, feel the beauty of mathematical ideas as well as the world as embodying these. There's something illegitimate in transferring the beauty of the world to some region apart from it. The ultimate entities for Whitehead are dipolar or bipolar with a B, as he sometimes says, such that present memories of the past give a unit experience a sense of haunting beyondness. That is, Whitehead has a tendency to view Platonic separation or chorismos diachronically, with the present partially separated from both the past and future, but in different ways. At times, Whitehead describes the dipolar character of the real in terms of the distinction between atomic or epochal actualities called natura naturans and continuous possibilities called natura naturata. But he is clear that these are ultimately inseparable aspects of a single reality, such that dipolarity should not be confused with metaphysical dualism. At other times, Whitehead's dipolarity surfaces in terms of the distinction between experient occasions and imaginal occasions. These two designations are not exactly equivalent to the distinction between matter and mind, respectively, but they're close. By experient occasion, Whitehead seems to have physical prehension in mind, whereas imaginal occasion refers to an actual occasion's attraction to possibilities. Whatever designations for dipolarity that are used by Whitehead point to the idea that sameness and diversity run inseparably through everything. Each pole renders the other intelligible. Each occasion is always passing on via some sort of continuity with its historic route. As in Plato, mere otherness is as unintelligible as unmitigated sameness. The protean character of the real is exhibited by ubiquitous creativity passing into otherness, by the production of relational contrast that does not necessarily weaken identity. Any definite being requires both sameness and diversity, both the growing together that occurs during concrescence and the expansion of the real made possible by superjective influence. The intensity of experience in an occasion might be negligible, but it can never be absolutely non-existent so long as it dynamically affects some others and is affected by some different others in Platonic fashion. Although mathematicians have a tendency to be Platonists in the sense of positing an ideal world apart from the actual one, or claiming that numbers exist before the world, on closer analysis, this Platonic impulse can be better explained in terms of the view that every entity emerges out of its relationships and out of its relational abstract qualities and does not substantially underlie them. Limitation of an ideal is not so much an imperfection as the attainment of actuality itself. As Plato realized, anything that is completely on its own, apart from relationships, including relations of numbers, is something like a Parmenidean one that we cannot know in any sense or even talk about. The key to the universe, from Whitehead's point of view, and here I could not resist putting in an exclamation point in this passage from Whitehead as the inspiration for this paper. The key to the universe, from Whitehead's point of view, is the synthesis of abstract sameness and contrasting relationship. It must be admitted that Whitehead's stance regarding Plato's forms admits of different interpretations on the evidence of the Harvard lectures. It seems that Whitehead leans in the direction of the standard view of Aristotle that forms, or abstract objects or eternal objects, cannot exist in complete abstraction. But at times it seems that he thinks that this was Plato's view as well, as when it is suggested that the abstract, in fact, is found in Plato in a most beautiful way. Admittedly, there are differences between Plato and Aristotle on the ontological status of forms, differences that Whitehead thinks might be due to the facts that Plato was a mathematician and Aristotle was the son of a doctor. Whereas Aristotle put the ideal into the flux, Plato put the flux into the ideal. A a formulation that fits well with the dynamic relations among the 5 major forms in Plato's Sophist discussed above. On this formulation, Plato goes astray only when he gives the impression that all value is in the eternal, a view that would be at odds with dipolarity, in that a static world cannot readily affect others and especially cannot be affected by others. Although both Plato and Aristotle are realists, Whitehead thinks that they have different views of the mathematical concept of a point. The subject-predicate logic of Aristotle leads to a subject-adjective prejudice that makes substances appear to be something like Parmenidean ones, like relationless points. By contrast, Plato sees points as geometrical fictions on Whitehead's interpretation. Points are limit concepts that are arrived at by way of the method of extensive abstraction, to be discussed momentarily if I have time. On Whitehead's view, Plato had some vague idea of the mathematical construction that is compatible with this method. Hence, he sides more with Plato than with Aristotle regarding points. Whitehead's distinction between a point and a moment is helpful here in that the latter term more easily signifies the relational character of the real, because there is always an earlier and a later moment in relation to any particular moment. Whereas a point might encourage belief in the sort of absolutely simple unity that is at odds with dipolarity. Something that counts in Plato's favor is that by availing himself of myth and by leaving his thought open to being interpreted as a panpsychist, he retains a, in scare quotes, primitive element that appeals to Whitehead. It is part of Plato's charm, he thinks. It is this element in Plato that also appealed to Wordsworth, who exerted a profound influence on both Whitehead and Hartshorne, as in Whitehead's appropriation of Plato's myth of recollection, as well as of Wordsworth's immortality ode. Indeed, I know of one process thinker who holds that Whitehead's chapter on the romantic reaction in science in the modern world is the most important thing that he ever wrote. There's no such thing as an abstract idea all by itself for either Plato or Whitehead. Thinking occurs in motion, not so much in the sense of continuous advance, but in terms of epochal becomingness. Even eternal objects are relational in the sense that they must enter into facts, perhaps not any particular facts, but some facts or other. The final concrete facts of the world that embody eternal or abstract objects are dipolar or bipolar physical mental occasions. In order to appreciate the...
You've got about 3 minutes, Dan.
Okay, good, thanks. In order to appreciate these final concrete facts, we need to return to Plato, as Whitehead emphasizes. That is, we need to sidestep, or better reject, Descartes and the idea that the mind and the body are not only separate, but are separate substances that individually need nothing else in order to exist. The concrete dipolar occasion, by contrast, is like a magnet that cannot have either of its poles severed. The two poles in an actual occasion cannot be disjoined, even if they can be conceptually distinguished. One pole is primary in the sense that it synthesizes or brings together physical perceptions, that is to say, physical prehensions, while the other mental pole supervenes on the first by bringing analysis to bear on what is received by way of physical prehension. As the Whiteheadian cliche has it, the many become one and are increased by one. Diversity and then unity or sameness, and then a new diversity followed by a new unity, and so on, everlastingly. What if I could just then indicate in section what I was going to do in section 4, titled Further Considerations. This is on page 13. I'd then like to take this dipolar character of being in Plato and Whitehead, and then bring it to bear on the method of extensive abstraction and deal with the concept of points again. I would use this notion to try to understand why Whitehead thinks that a Platonist would be in a better position to understand relativity physics than an Aristotelian. I would like to use it to understand why Whitehead agrees with the alleged motto over Plato's Academy. You know, if you don't know math, don't come, or you can't enter. And also, I think it may be fruitful to use this concept of dipolarity to understand the difference between Whitehead and Hartshorne in their concept of God, where Whitehead's sometimes held view that God is a single actual entity may run up against the concept of dipolarity in ways that Hartshorne's concept of God as a series of actual occasions, might not. But anyhow, I think this is a fruitful idea that may be useful in a lot of future thinking about various issues. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dan. So I'll give Dan a round of raucous virtual applause. It's good to see you. While people are gathering their thoughts, I can't help but, since someone's handed this up, I'll jump in. So the magnet example of dipolarity is, I think, useful because you've got something that has these two poles that are not they're different, as you said, they're not in tension. But I want to suggest, and the more I think about Whitehead, I wonder if dipolarity isn't the wrong thing to emphasize to try and get the system that and the world he's trying to defend. So to put it in tension with your suggestions and with Hartshorne's suggestions, it feels sometimes to me when I'm reading this that with Whitehead, that the substance tradition, he says, in the subject predicate language is fighting us in our trying to explain this version of reality where we're stuck in a form of grammar which is giving us all the wrong kind of metaphysical assumptions. And I wonder if we aren't doing the same thing and saying we've got to think about these two different poles, these two different aspects. We've got the physical, and some of these I want to buy, but some of them I want to, like the mental physical, for example. It feels to me like actually if we got it right, we wouldn't need to just be putting it in terms of still an opposition, which I think his system is designed to sort of help us think past eventually, that reality isn't ultimately having mental and physical aspects, that whatever reality is, it would be better to not try and just say it's got it as though those were opposing poles. That still seems to buy into a dualism that even though you're trying to overcome it, you're just sort of buying into its terms and it's still infecting the debate. I guess that's what I'm trying to suggest. So why continue to adopt a bipolar view if we're trying to get past a bifurcation is another way of putting it. I'll just pause there, just see what you think.
Yeah, I understand what you're getting at there. I know there was a famous Whitehead scholar a generation or two ago that referred to Whitehead's view as dynamic hylomorphism, so that each instance of reality is a mind body. I'm trying to say those two words quickly to run them together to try to avoid any like backdoor dualism that you're concerned about, right? Or each actual occasion is a soul body or a feeling body. I'm trying to say those words quickly to make them sound like one word. That may be one way to deal with the problem you mentioned. Although conceptually, there is a distinction between what a thing is in itself and what it is in relation. I take it that's Plato's point that Whitehead adopts, that it's very hard to do away with that sort of distinction.
I agree. And that's why I wonder if some of these are fruitful polarities and others are vicious, and so almost that we would, So I'll let Matt in and then Ronnie.
Thanks, Dan, for your paper. I loved it. My question is about how you think of Whitehead's relationship to Neoplatonism, I should say Plotinus's emanationist sort of rendering of Plato, where Whitehead, as you're pointing out, runs into this issue with God either being a single actual entity or, as Hartshorne says, a society, which would bring God more into alignment with the way the category of actual entities works everywhere else. But when we think about emanation, Whitehead didn't like it, I guess, because it wasn't dipolar enough, because you get matter at one end that's nothing and the one at the other that's everything. And yet, when you, as I've thought through, Plotinus's scheme in a Whiteheadian way, it actually starts to resonate more profoundly in the sense that matter as a nothing is kind of the negative end of a pole, and it starts to put the emanation scheme into more of a cycle. But Whitehead refers to emanation as puerile metaphysics, in is it Modes of Thought or Adventures of Ideas? I forget. So how do you think about Whitehead in relation to, Plotinus's rendering of Plato and the role of dipolarity in all of this?
Well, I can think of one positive point, one negative point. The positive point is that, you have this question that people ask for a couple thousand years about where the forms are, what is the ontological status of the forms. And if you take an extra-deical approach that suggests that in addition to the material stuff in the world and then the psyche stuff that's in the world, there's also this world of forms that seems to be floating out there on its own, giving rise to Aristotle's criticism of Plato and Aristotle's metaphysics. You can solve that problem by suggesting that the forms are what an ideal knower would know. So Plotinus seems to have an intradeical view regarding the status of abstract objects that would seem to be congenial to Whitehead and Hartshorne. So in that regard, I think the Neoplatonists are fruitful dialogue partners with process that. However, negatively, it seems that in Plotinus, you have like a quintessential case of what Hartshorne calls the monopolar prejudice, that if you have these contrasting terms, one in contrast to the many, and so on, Plotinus opts for one and rejects the other as inconsistent with the logic of perfection. And that's problematic for anybody who wants to defend the dyadic character of being. So there is this, so there is something valuable about unity, right? That there's some sort of identity that things have, right? But there's also something to be said in favor of diversity. That Plotinus too easily seems to opt for one pole at the expense of the other. And I think that's a real stumbling block. Although, from my point of view, reading Plotinus is a bit like reading Hegel in secondary literature about Plotinus and Hegel. Plotinus has been interpreted as a pantheist, as an apophatic theist, where there's a one beyond being, God is hyperousia, and so on. There's so many conflicting interpretations of Plotinus that sometimes it's hard to get a handle on which Plotinus it is you're trying to analyze. So, I don't know if I've responded adequately to your question.
No, thanks, Dan.
Yeah.
Ronnie.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for your paper. I enjoyed it a lot. With regard to one of your last points, that you wonder why Whitehead said that Platonists would be in a good position to understand Einstein's relativity. I think personally that this is not so much a compliment to Plato, but a critique of Einstein. Since in Greek mathematics, it's all about geometry and about the form, whereas one of the points of critique of Whitehead to Einstein is exactly that mathematics is no longer necessarily about geometry and about forms. It is about more abstract relationships than form only. So I think it's like the link is probably the same as the link he makes in the chapter on mathematics in science and the modern world. Mathematics as part of the history of thought. I don't remember the exact title. But maybe you disagree that it's not the Pythagorean view that he's referring to when he says that Platonists would understand relativity better.
Thanks. I hadn't thought of it that way. I had taken it on face value that he was paying a compliment to Plato, but actually it may have been a backhanded sort of slap against Einstein. Thank you. I have to think that through. That's a passage I thought I understood, but I might be completely wrong. So that's very helpful. Thanks.
Okay.
One thing, if we have more time, I'd like some input on what I say later in the paper, part I didn't read about the method of extensive abstraction, where, some people seem to have this Pythagorean or Aristotelian view of a point as fundamental, something like a Parmenidean one, that the universe is built up of these, relationless points, almost like a Seurat pointillist painting. Whereas Whitehead seems to have the view, that a point is a derivative item, right? Through the method of extension. If you have squares or circles that are halved in Russian doll fashion, you eventually infer the existence of a point. I take it that is very much compatible with this view of being as dipolar. You don't want to end up with the belief that the universe is made up of Parmenidean ones. So I think I understand that part of Whitehead, but the passage you mentioned, Ronnie, I'm going to have to rethink that one. Thanks.
Even though it's going to put us just a hair over, we haven't heard from Douglas Tooley yet, and I would love to invite him in. And Landon, I think unfortunately we're not going to have time first, but if you can put it in the chat perhaps. Douglas, would you like to jump in?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Professor Dombrowski, for your focus on these important subtle points on the mind-body relationship. I think they're crucial. For what it's worth, I used to live in the Seattle U neighborhood. I managed an apartment building while I was attending the University of Washington, but right across the street. Kind of like the movie Singles, if you saw that from the grunge era. And I have some substantive memories, but they're all ad hoc, as it were, with the institution. So my question is this: do you see any evidence in physics practice that goes to these questions, these subtle questions of the mind-body relationship that are worth pursuing? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not a physicist. I've only had one physics course in my life. I got an A in the course, but it was only an introductory course. I keep up with all the literature the process physicists put out, but I'm really not competent to, respond to that question. Although I can name about a dozen authors that I've read who would be much better responding than I would be. Ronnie's one of them, so he's on my Zoom screen here. So
everybody, put your favorite process physics person in the chat. There's lots of good literature.
I think I saw Jerome was here the other day too. So there's another person. So
Henry Stapp and lots of other good folks. Michael Epperson. Yeah.
Michael
well, let's all thank Dan for his work today. Thank you, Dan. It's always good to be with you, even if only virtually.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody.